The pursuit of creating habitats for wildlife in my yard led me to turn an unusable hillside into a creek-style water feature. It consists of several pools connected by waterfalls, is powered by natural bog filtration, and was built using DIY techniques to highlight native plants and animals. I expected this to be a simple one-week build, but it slowly morphed into one of the most ambitious projects I've ever done, and I nearly gave up on it altogether. A creek wasn't even part of the vision for my yard, which began in 2023. That's when I installed a large ecosystem pond with the help of my friends at Aquascape. Afterward, I began adjusting the landscape to better accommodate wildlife. As part of that, I was going to add a small secondary pond here until I made a discovery. Red-backed salamanders living under leftover stones. Like other species, they're often found near creeks, yet they live entirely on land. This was when I instead decided to make a meandering creek with subtler waterfalls than the pond that set this in motion. However, I didn't start building until April of 2025, with a goal of using materials I already had and doing the work by hand. Both created limitations. Scraps dictated the feature size, and moving stones like these without machinery was impossible. Still, I could build around these ones to establish a sense of scale and cohesion with the pond. Going below the frost line, for me around 18 inches, helps animals overwinter. With that and shelves in mind, I determined how to size the feature based on the liner before digging. Thanks to the dry ground, that went very well. If you've seen any of my other water feature builds, then you know I can't seem to escape the rain and the mud that follows. Rain or shine, working on a hill isn't straightforward. Here I had to go much deeper to offset the slope. I also went to the very edge of this stone to create a better transition later. The excavation would create a water depth of around 2 feet, while the hole itself is closer to 4. All I had to do then was remove small stones and tamp the surfaces flat. Adding geotextile fabric before the liner helps stabilize soil and prevent punctures. Installing the liner after that is easy enough. It just has to remain consistent and lay flat. Otherwise, pinches and stretching may cause leaks. Protecting the inside with fabric can help with that too. As you can see, things went smoothly to this point. Then the stones arrived. They were significantly larger than expected and challenged my goal of building by hand. In other words, this should have been a sign of things to come with this project, but for whatever reason, I continued like nothing was wrong. After scouring the pile to find manageable materials, I began hardscaping. This is one of my favorite parts because the rocks are what visually transform a hole into a water feature, typically a pond, but in this case a creek. That happens quickly too, and this one was no different. Neither was being stopped by the rain. Luckily it wasn't too bad when I returned. I just had to remove some water before continuing. Creeks are often full of branches and stumps, and placing wooden elements in backyard habitats is beneficial to wildlife. For those reasons, I wanted to use as much as I could, taking my time with each piece and modifying them as needed. As it came together, I could add the details like pea pebbles. I used them to backfill elements, creating stability, and added a layer to the bottom of the basin. My expectations of a quick build seemed realistic because all of that had occurred in just a few days. However, this is when I ran out of manageable materials and other things captured my attention. Before I knew it, an entire year passed me by. While incomplete, it filled with rainwater and became an ephemeral waterhole for various creatures, including frogs, toads, insects, and even a raccoon. Of course, I'm glad it was useful while sitting idle, but I was eager to finish what I started. At least the frogs liked it. After clearing some of the landscape, I eased into things by dragging a branch to the site. This was great inspiration for the long journey ahead, which began by making room for stones. I had examined the pile many times and came to realize there was actually a lot I could use. I just had to get it from underneath. With a lot of planning and the careful movements of a landscape bar, I easily gained access to what I needed. These rocks would form the waterfalls and bog filter in the upper section. I began by digging a small trench to establish a layout. Then I accounted for the bog, which would essentially be a deep hole filled with rocks. I later created a trench at the bottom for filter components and a shelf around the top to integrate hardscape. From there I moved to the falls. Like other builds, they consisted of stairs for water to flow down. This time, however, I put a basin below each to create prominent pooling areas. I'm sure the final excavation shows that better, but I made this illustration to represent how they're aligned. I used my final scrap of geotextile for this area and new materials for the rest. This was also when I prepped the transition between areas. Overlapping the liners in a way that water flows over and remains below the seams waterproofs it without adhesives. The footage doesn't really explain that too well, so I made another diagram. Anyway, after creating that, I added more geo. Since this area is small, I thought it best to use tall stones to save space instead of tiers. One from the salamander pile was perfect for that, and thankfully, unoccupied. I made a seamless transition between this area and the bottom with a few stones and a log, but that wasn't enough. I also retained the outside with a large stone and hid the liner's edge with a branch. This perfectly framed the first waterfall too, which consisted of flat stones backfilled with gravel. Throughout this process, I checked the water level in relation to materials, giving me a better idea of where to situate waterfall elements that would create the spillover effect from each pool. That would happen to some extent on its own, but filling voids with geotextile and foam greatly improves the effect. It's easily hidden with rocks, gravel, and moss too. Something I wanted to include that I haven't seen used much are upright tree snags. They're beneficial for wildlife, and I could use them to make sense of other branches. For example, I imagine this one fell from the stump I just added. After stabilizing them with stones, I did some edge work, like folding or trimming excess liner, and tamping soil. Then I made a branch retaining wall, which brought me back to the bog. I lined it and overlapped the seams like before, and added geo. I had originally planned to use a perforated drain pipe for where the water enters the bog, like the one you're seeing here, until I saw this trench drain. It was nearly perfect. I just created some holes along the sides and added an end outlet, allowing me to join a PVC pipe to it, as well as a cap with a hole at the end. This is where the pump will enter the system via this elbow and pipe. That brought me back up to the site where I joined it to a flex PVC pipe. It all fit together well, but it still needed a clean out. I decided to use a culvert for that because it's large enough for pumps and I could get multiple pieces from it. This length fit well. It just needed a notch to fit around the drain. In practice, water will fill this channel where sediments collect. Then it rises through a bed of rocks colonized by beneficial bacteria as well as plants at the top which purify the water and create stability. Once I finally filled it, which took forever by the way, I trimmed the pipe and arranged stones at the seam to create a waterfall. To fully integrate this into the rest of the landscape, I had to address this hill. I removed soil, added a few stones, and worked in a large snag. I thought it looked great and was the perfect companion for a retaining branch. Next was a stone retaining wall, which brought me back to the bog. A branch was perfect for blending the edge, and some stones for the rest. Afterward, I trenched for and concealed the pump's tube. This brought me down to the lower area, which would consist of waterfalls and an intake bay. I got to work on that, being mindful of the nearby salamander rock pile. Like before, I created the basic shape, but I had to drain some water so it didn't spill over. I sent that up to the bog so it wasn't wasted. Then I flattened the top, marked for the other areas, and dug. All of this left me with extra soil that I used to make a berm for the lower area. Doing so made it much easier to create the intake, which is deeper than the waterfalls before it. Unfortunately, when I started lining it, I got stopped by the rain again. At least it gave me a preview for the waterfalls, and the frogs seemed to enjoy it too. That meant I had to clean things yet again before continuing. This area would include a culvert with holes at the bottom for flow, and 2 milk crates to provide a void that gets covered by rocks. When I went to situate the liner and join the edges after that, I noticed something I should have taken more seriously. Yet I thought to myself, surely it's just groundwater, and continued anyway. I also used the remainder of the manageable stones before filling it to the original level. That meant it was time to initiate Plan B. Turn big rocks into small rocks. This can be done solely with a stone chisel, but I went for easy mode, an SDS drill. Creating holes allowed me to use feather shims to split the rocks, which I found to be extremely satisfying. However, the edges end up being sharp, so I chipped them down with a hammer. Large stones I could move, but not lift, were great for fortifying the berm before getting carried away with the area it retains. I just couldn't escape the rain and was stopped again. At the very least, it helps build patience, which is something you can't have enough of. Anyway, I added rocks and finalized the intake by backfilling around the pipe, drilling a hole for tubing, and trimming the culvert. An intake works best with a choke point. I made this one with a branch and foam to force water over the top and into the rocks. Adding some details after this had me excited because I believed I was in the home stretch. I rinsed and removed debris before filling. It's impossible to get all of it, but eliminating excess nutrients from construction greatly helps minimize algae growth, so the extra step is worth it. As the bog filled, water overflowed into the other areas, giving me a preview of things to come. This was also when I connected the pump. I had hoped to finish this with the details today, but I'm actually probably going to spend most of it fixing an issue that I noticed last night. Near the retaining wall down here, I saw water leaking out, and I thought maybe it's just groundwater from everything settling. Then I took a closer inspection of things and I realized that the feature was leaking, and I determined that it's happening from where this big area is connected to this area here. I didn't seam tape it or anything like that, and the way that the pieces overlap, I just don't think I did it well enough. So I have to take all of this out here, seam tape it, and then get it back together, and hopefully that will fix the issue. What I should have realized is that this was the same location where I thought I saw groundwater before. Nevertheless, I dismantled everything to join the seam. I cleaned the liners and placed a board underneath to provide a flat surface for the tape. Then I removed the backing, pressed the pieces together, and reassembled the falls. Fixing that leak was annoying, but I think it looks better than it did before, and it alerted me to a problem that I was unaware of. You can see the remnants of another leak down here, but this time what had happened was the tubing attached to the pump was siphoning water from the top area, pulling it over, and overflowing it into this area. So all I got to do is install a check valve. I ran out to get one of those. I'm gonna get it in, button up some things, and let this thing rip. This back siphon did cause a leak, and while the check valve stopped that, I think I was just looking for an excuse not to accept reality. TLDR, the creek was lowering, and runoff kept forming at the lowest point. That's when I ran some tests. First, I dug some holes near a pole that was lowering. They were dry until I refilled, confirming a leak, but I convinced myself it was only displaced groundwater and ran the feature anyway. That ended in disappointment as the creek quickly drained, and it wasn't from an obvious place like a low liner or waterfall edge. I had no choice other than to track down the leak. I removed the rocks from the pole I had just tested and didn't see a thing. I thought maybe water was being wicked by the geotextile or absorbed by the sandstone, so I ran another test. It leaked again. My only option then was to leave it alone and mark the levels elsewhere to find the lowest point, which would reveal the location of the holes. After a day, this one drained about an inch, and this one 3, while the bog and bottom remained the same. That meant I had to check this one again, and I actually found blemishes behind the only rock I didn't move. I wasn't convinced they could cause a leak, but I patched them anyway. To my surprise, it actually worked, and held water for nearly a week, so I rebuilt everything. I'll show you that process here so you can see it better. You simply clean the liner, remove a circle from the patching material, apply the primer and wait for it to become tacky, place something flat behind the material, like a board, press the patch into it, and use something to roll them together. If done properly, it works well. When I reviewed the footage, I saw 2 areas of concern, the right and behind these branches. Reluctantly, I dismantled these areas, and sure enough, there were many holes. I patched them like before and tested it again, but I wasn't as lucky this time. It continued leaking. So I started removing more rocks from the back when I thought to myself, what am I doing here? Clearly I was careless with the rocks, turning the liner into Swiss cheese. I wasn't convinced I'd even be able to find, let alone patch all the holes, and at this point, I had wasted well over a month trying to find the problem. I didn't want to spend any more time on this and genuinely considered scrapping the project altogether. Everything in me wanted to give up and use the materials for something else next year. After clearing my head for a few days though, I decided this was worth seeing through till the end and started over completely. By the time replacement materials had arrived, I made peace with the whole thing. There was a caveat though, the frogs that moved into the original area. In a perfect scenario, I knew I could rebuild this area in a day or two, and I didn't want to displace the frogs. My solution was to fill several containers in the garage to keep them safe until then. As I carefully took things apart, I netted the frogs when they emerged, but that wasn't all. They had bred last year, so I had to collect tadpoles as well. Thankfully, green frog tadpoles are quite large and easy to find. Most were even in the last stages of the metamorphosis. Even while taking precautions with geotextile, I know that mishandling stones is what got me into this situation. I wanted better control this time and decided to break up larger ones during the dismantle. Seeing it all in ruins was discouraging. However, this is also when I saw my first monarch of the season, which was a great reminder of why I wanted to do this in the first place. I took the opportunity to expand a few areas and better define the shelves too. Thinking ahead to minimize the frog's time away from home, Nate and I rolled a new liner to the site the day before. It measures 15 by 90 feet and is 60 millimeters thick. All that's to say, they were only a half an hour removed by the time we relined the hole with Geo. We also used it to protect the liner from hazards around the hole. Adding a single piece was challenging because of the feature's shape. At the time, I just really didn't feel like dealing with seams, but if I were to do this again, it would not be like this. It was also one of the hottest days of the year, and when exposed, this stuff gets hot, which is why we're wearing gloves. By the end of it, we were pretty exhausted, and I knew I could fine-tune it alone, so we stopped there. You may think that by this point I would have finally set realistic expectations for the build, but no. I thought surely I can finish this in less than a week. Spoiler alert, that did not happen, and it's been more than a month since. Thus, the long journey to rebuild commenced. I reworked the bog first because it dictates the liner's position. It ended up being more or less the same as before. I just placed more geo in the trench and revised the orientation to shorten the pump's tube. I was also able to fill it much quicker, even while taking the time to pressure wash sediments between layers. Then I adjusted the waterfalls and the original basin, which I had to get done ASAP. I wasn't taking any chances this time, placing anywhere from 2 to 6 additional layers of fabric under each stone, depending on its weight, and you better believe I was careful. Looking back, it's kind of astounding I've never had issues with this before. There were plenty of times I was more careless, even while putting stones directly on liner. Anyway, most of this was similar to before, but I did improve a few things, like how this branch wraps around the stone. With a better selection, I was able to rely less on stumps to create structure and could use them for other things. On the topic of structure, I should better highlight the importance of backfilling. Voids are a problem because they cause shifting that degrades integrity. Some movement is inevitable, but doing this well maintains long-term stability. Though incomplete, it wasn't far off from where we started this year, so I felt it was good enough for the frogs. I wanted the 30 or so little ones to have a chance to find shelter, so I released them first. Adding a lot of rocks to builds like this may seem like wasted space, but they're beneficial, especially when you're a little froglet on the menu in a froggy frog world. I added another stump to help with that too, though nature will take its course regardless. Getting the others was simple. One by one I coaxed them into a net, closed it up, and set them free. Seeing them back where they belonged in only 30 hours brought me a sense of relief. However, they typically leave the features at dusk to hunt and return at dawn. A large female was the first to begin venturing out. While she did, she was being admired from afar by the creek's alpha, who we named Big Hoss. He followed her out to the pond and didn't return to the creek for about a week. With a clear head, I shifted focus to the intake, adjusting the liner and adding several pieces of fabric. The crates and culvert could return as well. Having fabric layers allowed me to backfill more effectively than before. Then I was off to rebuild this area piece by piece. Being able to use the stumps for other things like the transition near this waterfall made a huge difference in the overall look. This is where I stopped for the day. Mind you, at this point the revision had only been running for a day, and I couldn't have done it soon enough. That very evening, the tree frogs arrived as they had many times before, but this time, thousands of eggs remained the morning after. That may not have been the case if more of the larger frogs had been present. Anyway, back to the wood. I distressed the top of the large snag to make it appear less artificial. This brought me back to the upper waterfalls. The rocks here are quite distinct, so I was able to get it looking virtually the same as before with little effort. However, the transition into the bog was much more successful this time, thanks to a stump. I also wasn't trying to make any more holes, so I protected the liner with rocks before cutting the culvert flush. This made it effortless to conceal. That's when I added gravel, rinsed everything down, and filled it up again. It's taken me a good bit longer to get back to this point than I expected, so much so that the gray tree frog tadpoles are pretty substantially sized by now, but I'm excited to get moving because I can finally start landscaping everything on the outside, which is when this is really going to take shape. The best place to start was with the juniper. It brought this location together and inspired me for the next step. Access was lacking, which led me to dismantle a section of the retaining wall to add stairs. The rocks from the wall were perfect for it. I just had to remove a sharp corner and split another. Then I dug a hole, lined it with fabric, leveled a stone, backfilled, and repeat. I integrated a branch to create a tiered planting spot too. Then I hid the tubing again and connected the pump. This time I secured fittings in a pipe directly to it and connected a union check valve to an elbow. At the creek I aligned the pieces, made adjustments, and connected them together. I also made a temporary adjustment for the developing tadpoles. Adding a stump to hold gravel slowed the flow enough to keep them from traveling. A frog approved of my work. I'm so excited to finally be back to this phase of the project. I'm about to fill it up and give it a real test run. I'd be lying though if I said I wasn't a little bit nervous just because of everything that happened, but I feel like it should be fine. One waterfall at a time, the creek came to life, and after everything I had been through, it was exciting. Like clockwork, the sound of water drew the frogs out, one of which enjoyed the falls. However, this part was leaking. Thankfully, it just had to be lifted up and framed with a branch. This seemed like a good place for another juniper. I also added stones around the edges, moss to this one, and branches to another to create a logjam effect. This was when I began adding native flowering plants. I won't go over them all, but a few highlights are black-eyed Susan, phlox, showy goldenrod, coneflowers, anise hyssop, and swamp milkweed. Immediately after planting them, a few insects arrived to feed, including a hummingbird moth, a black swallowtail butterfly, and a yellow woolly bear caterpillar. Providing flowers and host plants is helpful for insects, just as water is for frogs. However, creating habitats that support life cycles is better. That's what I was alluding to before with rocks and developing frogs. As for insects, a few things that can help are adding wooden elements to a garden and amending soil. For example, I mixed in sand under this branch to help support pupating insects. Of course, I wanted all of this to remain accessible, so I added another staircase in the midst of it. I think Big Hoss enjoyed these additions because this is when he returned to his creek. Nate stopped by again while I was at it to help me get this stump and extract roots from a fallen tree. I gave them a quick spray to remove dirt. Creeks often have roots along the edges, so these fit the theme perfectly. Then I adjusted this area, secured the liner to a branch, and placed the stump. Another became a snag, and this one a bridge. One of the most important parts of a successful looking design is seamless integration with the surrounding landscape. That takes time to achieve, but it all begins at this phase. Varying the edges like I did here with river rocks can help. However, nothing softens the edges quite like plants, which is why I added so many junipers alongside the flowers. Shrubs and trees are important too, both visually and for habitat. I had been dragging my feet on the left side, so I did that next. I adjusted this branch to frame the stairs. Then I stabilized the entire side with large stones. These provided unique areas for plants and created separation from the rest of the yard. Another area I had put off was near the intake. Here I added another flex PVC to hide and protect the pump's cord. All of the natural beauty of the stones had been hidden by mud. That's why I took the time to spray them down before adding some of the final details like natural hardwood mulch. I placed it directly on the soil in some areas, while in others I put down a layer of craft paper to mitigate weed growth. Something else I still had to add were marginal plants. I placed various sedges and irises directly into the gravel or in crevices. These greatly helped soften the edges and will aid in filtration, which brings us back to the bog. With soil and rocks, I placed these in fabric planters so I can move them around as needed during cleanouts. This finally led me to the bottom, where I had reserved a spot for the salamanders. I broke up the soil before mixing in some sand and mulch. Then I layered flat stones so the gaps underneath will remain even as the soil settles. I added mulch as well, ensuring the openings underneath were still accessible. What I didn't know when I saw the salamanders 2 years ago is that they usually live under recently disturbed objects, like the stones. That's because spaces under objects diminish as they settle, which is why I placed the new stones how I did. I can only assume that I took too long to build this because when I finally looked, they were gone. Since they inspired this build, I kinda can't help but laugh at how ironic that is. At the very least, other creatures will use this, and it's here for them if they return. I also had to hide the culvert. Now that's better. I made the foundation for a faux rock from stainless lath. Then I mixed up a lightweight, animal-safe concrete. I applied a thin layer of this to the lath to create a foundation. After it cured, I primed the surface and added a thicker layer, which I textured by pressing stones into it. I let it cure before attempting to mimic the appearance of real stones with glazes and sanding for highlights. I've outlined the process more thoroughly in these videos if you want to know more. The idea is that everything under these will remain fully accessible, and while there are plastic and fiberglass rock covers available, they tend to look more artificial. I want to do this elsewhere in my yard, so this was kind of a trial run. That said, these do need to be sealed to protect them from UV exposure and freeze thaw. I felt this was good enough for the time being to bookend everything though, so I can finally move on. The magic behind this modified pond design that I'm calling a creek is its shape. Video doesn't do it justice, but the way it weaves through the hillside makes it very dynamic, especially with the stairs. Having various pools separated by so many visual barriers expands the usable footprint of the creek because in the scheme of water features, it's not very large. The fact that it houses so many frogs perfectly illustrates my point. These are all individuals within their claimed parcels, including Big Hoss and many of the babies, who aren't quite as small now. Thanks to the healthy population of insects, like the ant this one is eating, they're growing fast. The modified waterfall did the trick too, because most of the tadpoles either have legs, or have become frogs. Now it's not to say they couldn't have survived in the intake, but a larger space provides more opportunity for food and such. Also, I had originally planned to add native nanofish to fit the creek theme. I'm hesitant to do that now because of how well the frogs are doing, but as things fill in and establish, it may help add balance, so I'm unsure. What do you think? I've put so much focus on frogs because I have a bias. They're my favorite animal. However, I designed this with others in mind too. I haven't seen it yet, but birds will be able to bathe in the shallows, and this has already become a destination for other species like harvestmen, a slug, many dragonflies, a wolf spider, and of course countless pollinators. It's amazing how much activity the natives drum up, and this was filmed on a slow day. I thought this would only take about a week to complete when I began, and even now I wish it had. However, after pausing last year and spending the past 4 months on it, I believe that makes me appreciate it more. The original DIY pond had a similar trajectory, and even though it was rudimentary at best, I still look back on it fondly, so in some ways, this is kind of like its spiritual successor. I'm certain this would have been done in 2 to 3 days if I had hired a pro, but where's the fun in that? Let's be honest though, I'm saying that partly in jest to cope with how I spent my time. At the very least, I learned a lot, and my trials probably made for a better video. There were many moments I wanted to give up or rush, but at a certain point I yielded and allowed the process to take the time it needed. I think that was probably the right choice. I'm excited to see how it develops, and what animals decide to use it next. It still isn't finished though, which is especially evident on the right, where it will seamlessly join with the rest of the landscape. There's also much more that happened with the animals that I didn't share, which leads me to the remaining question many of you likely have. What about a pond update? Believe me, I see the comments. I've been documenting it since 2024. Much has happened, and I'm excited to share it near the end of the season. I'm creating a movie-like experience for it on the Tanner Serpa channel like last time. For whatever reason, an episodic format or deviating too far from the nature design build style content tends not to work here. I want to maximize my efforts and provide the best experience without taking creative concessions, if that makes sense. I'll post about it on the community when it's up. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this project, and I thank you so much for watching. Until next time, Serpa Squad, take care and peace.